March the 23rd, 1945. The Rhine River near the shattered German town of Wesel. Before dawn, the fog still hung low across the water, thick, damp, and grey as gunmetal. Along the western bank, engineers of the U.S. Ninth Army crouched in silence beside long rows of aluminum pontoons. Their uniforms were soaked through with river mist. Motors idled softly, muffled under tarps. Somewhere behind them, the thunder of heavy artillery broke the stillness, not to destroy targets now, but to mask the sound of their own preparations. For weeks, everyone in the Allied command had known that crossing the Rhine, Germany's last great natural barrier, would mark the beginning of the end. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But this crossing was different. It wasn't being attempted by paratroopers or bridgeheads seized by stealth. It was to be built, engineered in the open. In less than 3 hours, these men were expected to construct a floating bridge strong enough to carry 50-ton Sherman tanks, entire armoured columns that would push into the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The order seemed impossible. Yet, by midday, American tanks were rolling over the Rhine on a bridge that had not existed that morning. This is the story of how that happened, not through luck, nor overwhelming manpower, but through a decade of quiet engineering work that transformed river crossings from acts of desperation into feats of calculation. It's the story of how the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers turned the most primitive concept in warfare, a bridge of boats, into a mathematically precise machine of war. And, like most revolutions in the Second World War, it began long before anyone fired a shot. When the United States entered the war in December of 1941, its engineers inherited an uncomfortable truth. The U.S. Army's combat doctrine had been built for roads and railways, not rivers. In Europe, rivers were everywhere: the Seine, the Meuse, the Moselle, the Saar, the Rhine, each one broad, fast, and capable of turning entire armies into stationary targets. The Wehrmacht had used those same rivers to devastating effect in 1940. French tanks and infantry, unable to bridge or ford quickly, had been trapped by geography as much as by tactics. The U.S. Army watched those events carefully. Among the officers who paid the closest attention were men who wore engineer insignia instead of infantry patches. Colonel Eugene Raybould, later Chief of Engineers, wrote in 1941, "A river can be as formidable a fortress as any wall of stone." In the coming years, that observation would define how the Allies fought across Western Europe. But at the time, American bridging technology was outdated. The standard pontoon bridge of 1941 had changed little since the First World War. Wooden pontoons lashed together with steel pins, assembled slowly by hand, and capable of supporting little more than a truck or a light field gun. The heaviest design in production, the Muno steel pontoon bridge, could carry about 15 tons under ideal conditions. That meant it could handle a jeep, a those fort and cargo truck, or perhaps a small artillery piece but not a Sherman tank, which weighed between 33 and 46 tons, depending on its armor package and equipment. The gap between what engineers could build and what the modern battlefield demanded was enormous. By 1942, the Army's vision for mobile warfare had evolved into something that depended entirely on mechanized logistics, armored divisions moving continuously, supported by fuel convoys, artillery, and mobile command posts. Every one of those vehicles had to cross rivers. So, in the quiet workshops of the Engineer Board at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and the bridging test grounds at Fort Benning, Georgia, a new philosophy took shape. The idea was simple in theory but revolutionary in execution. Build modular, prefabricated bridge sections that could be carried by truck, unloaded by crane or manpower, and assembled into a bridge that could bear 50 tons, all without fixed foundations. To make that possible, engineers had to confront the physics of buoyancy itself. A 50-ton Sherman imposed nearly 100,000 pounds of downward force, through its treads concentrated over an area barely larger than a pair of dining tables. To carry that load, each pontoon had to displace an equivalent weight of water. That meant every 10-foot section of the floating bridge needed pontoons capable of supporting at least 10 to 12 tons with redundancy for dynamic loads, like when a tank's track slammed down from a bump or when the current pushed laterally against the bridge. The math was unyielding. The only solution was to move from traditional wooden boats to lightweight steel pontoons, each shaped to minimize drag and maximize buoyant lift. The result was the Mdos Treadway Bridge, a system of hollow steel pontoons supporting prefabricated treadway sections over which tanks could drive directly. Each treadway section was 10 feet long, weighing roughly 2,000 pounds. When assembled, 2 treadways ran side by side, spaced precisely to match the tracks of a Sherman tank. Each pontoon, or bay, as engineers called them, could be launched into the water in under 2 minutes. The sections were locked together with steel pins and connected by flexible hinges that allowed the entire structure to rise and fall with the current. In theory, a trained company of engineers could deploy an Mdos bridge across a 150-foot river in 3 hours. In practice, under fire and at night, the difference between theory and practice would be measured in lives. But the doctrine persisted because it was necessary. The Mdos bridge represented more than just steel and rivets. It embodied a shift in how armies conceived of mobility. In the 19th century, rivers were obstacles. In the 20th, they became opportunities for coordination, provided an engineer could build fast enough. Yet even as the design matured, few outside the corps of engineers believed that such bridges could truly carry tanks. Infantry officers distrusted the idea that a handful of floating metal boxes could support 50 tons of steel and ammunition. Armoured officers doubted that such bridges could be built fast enough to keep up with advancing units. To them, it seemed like theory, like something devised by men who had never seen the chaos of a real battlefield. The men of the 290 Unost Engineer Combat Battalion would prove them wrong. The 290 Unost was an ordinary unit by the paperwork part of the 1st U.S. Army under General Omar Bradley. But by late 1944, they were anything but ordinary in experience. They had built bridges under shellfire in Normandy, improvised crossings under flood conditions on the Seine, and repaired roads that barely existed on the approach to the Ardennes. When the Battle of the Bulge began in December, they didn't retreat. They built roadblocks, mined approaches, and delayed entire German armoured columns by blowing bridges in sequence. Their actions during the defence of Malmedy bought the U.S. First Army precious hours that would later prove decisive. By March of 1945, those same engineers were tasked with the opposite mission, to build a bridge not to delay, but to advance. At 9 o'clock, on the night of March the 23rd, their trucks rolled into the staging area west of the Rhine, near Wesel. Each carried steel pontoon sections, treadways, and the tools needed for assembly. The men worked in darkness, laying out gear along the bank while the artillery kept up a deafening barrage across the river. Shortly after midnight, the first assault boats went in carrying infantry across to establish a shallow bridgehead on the far bank. Once secure, the engineers began launching their pontoons. Each pontoon was lifted by cranes and lowered into the current. The river ran swift and cold, nearly 200 yards wide. Teams of men, waist-deep in water, guided the pontoons into alignment. Others laid down the treadways, 2 parallel steel ribbons stretching from shore to shore. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the first section locked into place. By 4, they had 30 feet. By 6, the bridge extended halfway across. Each minute mattered. Every section completed brought them closer to the eastern bank and to the possibility of moving tanks into Germany proper. By mid-morning, the bridge was complete, a 1,100-foot span of floating steel, capable of supporting a continuous column of Sherman tanks, trucks, and artillery. The crossing of the Rhine at Wesel was achieved in less than 3 hours of assembly time, exactly as the manuals predicted. To most observers, it looked miraculous. To the engineers, It was the result of endless drills, revised designs, and a philosophy that placed faith not in brute force but in precision. As one battalion officer wrote afterward, "Every man knew his task, and every tool had its place. It was not courage that built that bridge, but confidence born of repetition." Yet the true story of that confidence begins not in 1945, but years earlier, in the laboratories and test fields where men like Colonel Drew S. Luton and Captain William F. Cass developed the first steel treadway prototypes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their work was meticulous, unglamorous, and frequently dismissed by higher commands more interested in tanks and aircraft than in bridge pontoons. But they understood something fundamental, that mobility in modern war was not about speed, it was about continuity. A tank could advance at 25 miles per hour, but if it reached a river it couldn't cross, it might as well have been stationary. The slowest element determined the pace of the entire offensive. The engineer's task was to eliminate those pauses to turn geography itself into a temporary inconvenience. That was their invisible war. The real test of the Mdos Bridge came not at Wesel, but months earlier when engineers faced rivers swollen with snowmelt and artillery fire still falling on both banks. The crossing of the Moselle in September of 1944 nearly broke the doctrine that had made the steel treadway possible. The 1113, the engineer combat group, had been ordered to construct a bridge near Arnaville, France, to support General George S. Patton's Third Army. The Moselle was deceptively calm from a distance, but its current was fast enough to twist entire pontoons out of line. Engineers called it a living river, one that fought back. They began assembly at dawn. German mortars bracketed the river, walking shells steadily down the bank. Men carried the heavy treadway's 10-foot steel beams, slick with oil, while others wrestled the pontoons into place. When the first sections went in, the current snapped the alignment cables like thread. 2 pontoons broke free and vanished downstream. Patton himself arrived hours later and watched in silence from a rise above the bank. The engineers had been working for nearly 20 hours straight. Men were collapsing from exhaustion, yet the bridge extended only halfway across. The enemy's artillery was zeroed in. Every new section brought another salvo. At one point, a shell struck a pontoon squarely, tearing it open and hurling fragments across the water. The bridge sagged, half submerged. Instead of retreating, a sergeant waded into the freezing current with a hammer and chain, securing a replacement section under direct fire. His hands were bleeding when he returned, but the bridge held. By nightfall, the treadway was complete. Tanks crossed within minutes, Shermans of the 4th Armoured Division, clattering over steel that was still slick with river water and blood. Patton later wrote in his diary, "My engineers are the bravest men I have ever seen. They build where others destroy." That crossing at Arnaville proved 2 things. The Mdos design worked, and its true limitation was not material. It was time. Every minute of delay meant more incoming fire. Every pontoon had to be perfect, not just in structure but in placement. The margin for error was 0. From that day on, every engineer battalion in Europe began drilling with a new urgency. They rehearsed at night, under simulated bombardment, timing every motion. The bridge that would cross the Rhine in March did not come. From a blueprint it came from those countless repetitions. The Mdos treadway was only one part of a larger system. Alongside it, the engineers developed pontoon ferries, essentially fragments of the bridge, equipped with outboard motors. These ferries could carry a single Sherman tank at a time before a full bridge was ready. In the opening hours of most river crossings, the first vehicles to cross did so on these makeshift rafts. Each ferry consisted of 2 pontoons joined by treadways, forming a stable platform about 20 feet long. With the help of 2 50-horsepower outboards, it could carry a 50-ton load across moderate currents. The ferry method gave armoured commanders a way to establish a presence on the far bank while the main bridge was still under construction, a risky but sometimes necessary compromise. The Germans, for their part, recognized the threat. They had relied heavily on demolishing bridges during their retreats, assuming it would take the Allies days to rebuild. When the Americans began throwing bridges across in hours, the Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine began to collapse. German war diaries from the Western Front in early 1945 repeatedly mention enemy bridge-laying units working with impossible speed. At Rhine, where the Americans captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact on March the 7th, the reaction was one of disbelief, but that bridge was an exception. The real shock came when German observers saw floating treadways being built only a few miles downstream under direct shell fire. To German commanders trained in the First World War tradition, a pontoon bridge was a temporary, fragile structure something infantry might use. Never tanks, but Allied engineers had quietly erased that distinction. The irony ran deep. In 1941, German pioneer units had led the world in military bridging technology. They fielded modular pontoon systems capable of carrying 20 tons and had used them to stunning effect during the invasions of France and the Soviet Union. Yet by 1944, Germany lacked the industrial resources to maintain or replace those systems. Their once formidable engineer corps was depleted, while the Allies, fed by Detroit's factories and American steel, could mass-produce hundreds of MDOS components per week. In that reversal lay one of the quiet tragedies of the war. The side that had first mastered mobile warfare had lost the industrial means to sustain it. On the Rhine, that industrial power manifested as precision. Each MDOS pontoon was stamped from cold-rolled steel, welded in halves, and pressure-tested at 200% of its rated load. The sections were coated with bituminous paint to resist corrosion and sealed with rubber gaskets at every joint. The design's genius was modularity. Every part fit on a standard 2.5-ton truck, known universally as the deuce and a half. A convoy of 20 trucks could carry an entire bridge, over 1,000 feet long. In practice, a single engineer company could build it from nothing but road cargo within hours. Commanders soon learned to plan offensives with these convoys in mind. In war diaries and field orders, one finds a pattern: an armoured division halted at a river, engineers arriving within hours, tanks moving again by dawn. The rhythm of the war changed, but the engineers paid dearly for it. Casualty rates among combat bridging units were among the highest of any support branch, higher, in some sectors, than frontline infantry. During the Moselle crossing alone, the 1100 lost 34 men killed and nearly 100 wounded. Many died not from bullets but from drowning swept away while handling cablers in the dark. They carried no glory. There were no medals for precision, no headlines for calculations done in freezing water. Yet without them, the armoured spearheads that symbolised Allied victory could not have moved a mile beyond the first obstacle. One of the most remarkable innovations of the period came from the British, whose Royal Engineers had faced similar challenges in crossing the Seine and the Scheldt. They developed the Bailey Pontoon Bridge, a hybrid of their famous prefabricated Bailey truss with American floating support. It could bear over 70 tons, enough for a Churchill tank or even a self-propelled gun. When the Allies began operating jointly along the Rhine, American engineers integrated Bailey components into their own designs, creating composite bridges that combined the best of both nations' engineering. At Wesel, British and American bridge companies worked side by side, sharing steel pins, measuring tapes, and coffee heated over makeshift stoves. The partnership revealed something deeper about wartime engineering. There were no secret formulas, no lone inventors defying orders in laboratories. There was only collaboration, the slow accumulation of lessons learned under fire. At the operational level, the crossings of March 1945 were the embodiment of that philosophy. The Ninth Army alone built 10 major bridges across the Rhine within a week, including 3 heavy-duty treadways and multiple infantry footbridges. The First and Third Armies added dozens more. The speed was unprecedented. Between March the 23rd and March the 31st, Allied engineers laid more bridging material than the entire German army had managed in the first 2 years of the war. The psychological effect on the enemy was immense. Reports from German units retreating eastward spoke of bridges appearing overnight. In this sense, the engineers had waged a kind of invisible psychological warfare. They attacked not soldiers, but expectations. One eyewitness, Captain Robert F. Langley of the 290 Unost, described the moment the first tank crossed the Rhine at Wesel. "We stood there on the fair bank, watching that Sherman creep onto the treadway. Everyone held their breath. You could hear the creak of the pontoons, the whine of the engine. Then the bridge settled, flexed, and held. The tank went on, and another followed. And another. And that's when I realized we'd done it. The Rhine wasn't a wall anymore. The crossing marked more than tactical success. It marked a shift in how soldiers understood technology. The men who had once doubted the idea of floating bridges now trusted their lives to them without hesitation. For armoured crews, the steel pontoons became as familiar as roads. For infantry, they symbolized forward motion proof that no obstacle was permanent. The irony was profound. A structure designed for temporary use had become the foundation of momentum. As the war in Europe drew to its close in May of 1945, many of those bridges were dismantled within days of their construction. Their materials were recycled, their pontoons drained and shipped to depots for peacetime storage. Few physical traces remained, but the legacy endured. The post-war U.S. Army continued refining the concept, leading to the M4 and later M70, floating bridge systems used in Korea and Vietnam. The underlying principle, modular, rapidly deployable support, became a standard of modern military engineering. In civilian life, the technology inspired temporary flood bridges, oilfield causeways, and even disaster relief platforms. The wartime invention of a treadway strong enough for a tank became a peacetime lifeline for trucks bringing food and medicine to flood zones. That dual legacy destruction giving way to reconstruction was something the engineers themselves recognized. Many of them returned home and joined the nascent highway projects of the 1950s, applying the same logic of modularity to bridge construction across America. Looking back, it's easy to see the crossings of 1945 as inevitable and natural, consequence of Allied superiority. But inevitability is a retrospective illusion. At the time, success hung on a chain of fragile choices, an engineer's insistence on steel instead of wood, a colonel's demand for modular design, a sergeant's decision to stay in the water a moment longer to secure one last pin. The Mdos Treadway Bridge was not glamorous. It was not a weapon. Yet it embodied the essence of total war, the transformation of abstract physics into survival. When the first tank rumbled across the Rhine that morning, the engineers did not cheer. They simply stood in the rain, watching their creation vanish under the tracks. The bridge flexed, but did not fail. Then, in quiet sequence, the next vehicle followed. It was an act of faith as much as of engineering, faith in numbers, in design, in each other. And that is how, on a grey morning in March 1945, a river that had once divided empires became just another road. The minds who made such courage possible. Because behind every pontoon, every steel pin, and every assembly diagram that guided men through chaos, there were engineers who never saw the rivers they helped to cross. Some were civilians, tucked away in nondescript offices far from the front lines. Others were military officers trained not to fight, but to solve, mathematicians, bridge designers, and mechanical tinkerers who found themselves working under the most peculiar of constraints: how to make war move faster. At the heart of this silent architecture stood the Engineer Board at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, the U.S. Army's nerve center for all field engineering innovations. It was here, in 1940 and 1941 that the first full-scale models of what would become the M2 Treadway Bridge were built in secret, on an artificial pond, surrounded by pine trees and mud. The men testing those prototypes weren't soldiers in the usual sense. They were structural engineers in uniform. Their language was one of load charts and stress factors, not tactics. But as the world careened toward global war, their calculations began to carry the weight of strategy itself. One of them, a 34-year-old named Captain John P. Vale, had previously worked as a civil bridge designer in Ohio. His notebooks, preserved in the Belvoir archives, show the early dilemmas. "We can't weld everything," he wrote in April 1941, and faith, for stage notebooks known path, to won the path, the men in the field won't have the equipment. It must bolt, pin, or latch, preferably all three. The men will be tired. That last sentence may be the most important design principle ever written in the history of wartime engineering, because the M2 bridge was built not for ideal conditions, but for exhaustion, for hands shaking from cold, for half-light and fear and rain. Every latch was over-designed, every pin was oversized. If a soldier missed by an inch, the system still worked. Vale and his colleagues ran test after test, not for time strength, but for speed. They timed teams of engineers racing to assemble prototypes. They measured how long it took to float a pontoon, align two sections, lock them, and place the treadway beams. When one trial team assembled a 50-foot span in just under 2 hours, the room erupted in applause. But Vale wasn't satisfied. He walked to the blackboard and wrote, "Uno treinta, 90 minutes, the new target." By the end of 1942, his team met it. The success of the Treadway Bridge was, in part, the triumph of modular thinking, a philosophy that had been quietly revolutionizing engineering since the Industrial Revolution, but had never before been applied to something so large and so urgent. The modular idea was deceptively simple. Make every part identical and interchangeable, so that anyone, anywhere, could build the whole. Henry Ford had used it to build cars. Now the Army would use it to build mobility itself. Each pontoon section of the M2 was symmetrical, meaning there was no front or back. Every treadway panel could connect to any other. Every pin was identical in diameter. The entire system could be assembled without measuring a single part. That philosophy, no wrong way to assembly, was what allowed exhausted soldiers to throw bridges across the Rhine at 3 a.m. under artillery fire. To the engineers, the achievement was aesthetic as much as functional. "Elegance," one of them wrote, "is not luxury, it is reliability under pressure." But even as the M2's design matured, the Army's logistical mind faced another problem: how to move the bridge itself. Each pontoon weighed nearly 0.000 pounds empty. Fully equipped with treadways, cables and hardware, a 1,000 foot bridge demanded more than 60 trucks and trailers. If the convoys fell out of sequence, the system broke down. To solve that, the Army Corps of Engineers did something radical. They adopted an industrial scheduling system inspired by American railroads. Every bridge train operated as a mobile factory. Each truck carried specific numbered components, arranged in order of assembly. Truck, no. Uno carried anchor cablers and winches. Truck, no. Those carried the first treadways. Truck, no. Tress, followed with pontoons A and B, and so on. This logistical choreography was a marvel of hidden precision. By the time the frontline units called for a bridge, the trucks were already on the road, their contents labelled not with serial numbers, but with assembly order codes a visual language of wartime efficiency. In February 1945, as the Allies advanced toward the Rhine, that logistical network stretched across half of Europe. From ports in Antwerp and Le Havre, MDOS components were shipped by rail to depots near Liège and Brussels, then loaded onto truck convoys headed east. At the peak of the campaign, over 10,000 tons of bridging material were moving across the continent at any given time, a river of steel on wheels. To keep pace, engineers adopted one of the earliest examples of real-time logistics reporting. Units would radio back bridge progress reports, coded as percentages. Bridge dose, 65% complete. Treadway alignment stable. Bridge 17, 80% complete. Current moderate. Awaiting reinforcement. These terse transmissions carried enormous consequences. A 10% delay might stall an entire armored corps. A 5% misalignment might strand a division. The entire operational tempo of the Western Front hung on these fragments of data, and behind them the engineers, waist-deep in icy water, translating numbers into motion. Not all stories ended in success. At the Rhine River in February 1945, a miscalculation of current speed led to catastrophe. The engineers of the 290 Unit were attempting to launch a treadway section when the anchor lines slipped. The entire span swung out of position and began to collapse downstream. Men leaped onto the pontoons to save the assembly, but the current was too strong. 4 were swept away. The bridge broke apart in minutes. Later analysis revealed the cause. A faulty cable reel 1 that had been reused beyond its rated limit. The incident became a quiet legend among engineer units, a grim reminder that the smallest failure could undo months of preparation. In response, the Army revised its entire maintenance protocol for bridging equipment within weeks. Every cable, every clamp, every pin would be inspected before deployment. That night on the Rhine cost lives, but it saved many more in the months that followed. Meanwhile, as the engineers refined their craft, the technology itself began to evolve in subtle ways. The original MDOS design had used steel pontoons, strong but heavy. Late in the war, the Army introduced a new inflatable rubber pontoon, designed by Goodyear. It could be packed into a crate, inflated in minutes, and supported loads up to 30 tons. The system never replaced the steel version for heavy tanks, but for light vehicles and infantry crossings, it proved revolutionary. In a sense, the MDOS had already sown the seeds of post-war innovation. Modular thinking would inspire not just military bridging, but prefabricated architecture in general, everything from temporary airfields to mobile hospitals. The war, for all its destruction, had forced the world to think in units, in repeatable patterns, in universal components. The kit became a symbol of both efficiency and adaptability. It's easy, decades later, to overlook the psychological side of such work. To outsiders, the engineer corps was all precision rulers, blueprints, clipboards, but to those who served in it, the job carried its own form of terror. You could not shoot back at a river. You could not take cover from physics. A machine gunner might survive by instinct. An engineer survived by calculation. When that calculation failed, men died not from malice, but from numbers gone wrong. That kind of responsibility leaves marks. Many. Veterans later described dreams in which they were building bridges that never ended, sections sliding away just as they reached the far bank. It was as if their subconscious minds never stopped assembling, never stopped calculating. Perhaps that is the true cost of engineering under fire, to live in a world where every failure is literal weight. Yet the story of the pontoon bridge isn't one of despair. It is one of audacity, the belief that a handful of men, armed with little more than geometry and grit, could reshape the landscape itself. In that sense, they were not just soldiers. They were inheritors of an older tradition, the bridge builders of Rome, the canal diggers of the industrial age, the anonymous labourers who connected worlds. But where those ancient builders sought permanence, the engineers of 1945 pursued the opposite, impermanence perfected. Their bridges were meant to vanish. They existed for hours or days long enough to let an army pass, then dismantled, melted, repurposed. They left behind no monuments, only photographs and memories. Yet those ephemeral structures changed the war more profoundly than any fortress or gun. In the weeks after the Rhine crossing, as the Allies surged toward the Elbe, the engineers faced one final challenge: exhaustion. Bridging companies had been working continuously for months. Equipment was wearing out. Fuel shortages plagued the convoys. The steel treadways, exposed to water and mud, began to corrode. And yet, the rhythm continued. Bridge, cross, advance, repeat. By late April, some units had built their 35th or 40th bridge since Normandy. Men joked that they'd spent more time on water than on land. At the Elbe, the engineers again proved indispensable. The final major crossings of the war were conducted by the 150th and 168th Engineer Combat Battalions. By then, the process was nearly automatic, a choreography of efficiency, refined by 2 years of repetition. When the first American vehicles crossed into territory soon to be occupied by the Soviets, the bridges beneath them were Emdo's treadways, descendants of the prototypes tested in that quiet pond at Fort Belvoir 4 years earlier. After the war, Captain John P. Vail returned to civilian life. He resumed designing bridges, though none, he said, ever felt quite as alive as the ones he'd built for war. In an interview years later, he reflected on what he'd learned. When you design a bridge for peacetime, you think about beauty and cost. When you design for war, you think about time. Time is the enemy. If you can beat time, you've already won. That, in essence, was the legacy of the wartime engineers. They turned time itself into a weapon. Each hour saved was a mile gained. Each minute shaved from assembly meant another tank across, another breakthrough, another day closer to peace. Their bridges may have been temporary, but the principle they embodied, speed as structure, has never disappeared. In the modern world, echoes of the Mdo's philosophy are everywhere. Disaster relief teams deploy modular pontoon bridges to reach flooded towns. Military engineers still train with treadway systems whose lineage can be traced directly to 1944. Even space architecture, the design of modular habitats for lunar or Martian missions, borrows from the same logic of interchangeable, self-aligning units. The core idea remains timeless. Make the system simple enough that it can survive chaos. That is why the story of those wartime bridges still resonates. It isn't just about steel and water, it's about faith in design as a form of courage. The conviction that even in the most uncertain conditions, order can be built piece by piece. In the end, the bridges across the Rhine were dismantled, their steel melted down, their pontoons repurposed for peacetime use. But if you visit Wesel today, you can still see faint traces of old concrete ramps where the approaches once met the river, rusted bolts embedded in the shoreline. Locals call it simply the Old Crossing. Few tourists stop there. The Rhine flows on, indifferent as it always has. Yet if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear it, the rhythmic clang of hammers, the murmur of commands shouted over the wind, the rising growl of engines as the first tanks rolled across. A temporary road, built to disappear, but destined to be remembered. That was the paradox of the pontoon bridge. Impermanence made immortal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.